Imagine, if you will, the following scenario. Along all the coastlines of the world, great behemoths, remarkably similar in shape and size to Godzilla, rise forth from our oceans. These monsters are some 400 foot tall, possess natural armor thicker than steel, and emanate deadly radiation, able to expel it in destructive fiery cone that melts virtually anything and poisons those few things it does not kill with radiation. There are, in this potential scenario, tens of thousands of these monsters, each as deadly and dangerous as the real Godzilla is. Let us call this the Godzilla threat. And the first thing you would ask yourself is what your reaction to just such a threat would be. Though there might be some initial skepticism, after watching mass destruction of a sort only imagined in film and fantasy, the vast majority of people would acknowledge the real nature of the situation. Few, if any, would be in denial that there were Godzilla, and in proposing solutions to this threat, most people would recognize the presence of untold numbers of 400-foot tall radioactive monsters to be a clear and present danger. In all likelihood, violence would have to be part of the solution, and the details of any proposed solution would be found in the nitty-gritty discussion of how to apply that violence. And you might be asking yourself, correctly I might add, why would I even invoke such an image, as it both sounds and is ridiculous? The answer to that question is very simple. Godzilla is big, very big, and extremely visible. No one, under such circumstances, could deny the existence of the Godzilla threat, and there would most likely be a genuine unanimity in attempting to deal with this threat, with, as mentioned prior, minor divergences in the details, but the point stands that Godzilla is a very large, scary monster. No one could even miss him, even if they tried to. Now, the visible portion of the electromagnetic spectrum makes up an incredibly small fraction of the total electromagnetic spectrum, and less than 1% of all light that reaches us is in the visible spectrum. Most estimates put it around 0.0035% of the entire electromagnetic spectrum, and as the human eye is incredibly limited in its range, we can only see one tiny fraction of the entirety of the electromagnetic spectrum. We see quite well within that tiny band, admittedly, but beyond that, nothing. If we could see within all wavelengths, the nighttime sky would be almost as bright as the daytime sky. Is this constraint to our sight a potentially harmful limitation? Well, it depends, as with all things, on how you look at it. In the context of what is sometimes called the EEA, or the Environment of Evolutionary Adaptiveness, missing out on the vast majority of the electromagnetic spectrum was not detrimental enough such that there was an adaptation that endowed us with an ability to see, say, gamma rays. Hindsight being what it is, being able to see gamma rays likely would not have contributed to the survival and fitness of our ancestors. On the other hand, there are many types of insects that can see the ultraviolet wavelength of light. For example, bees are trichromatic, like humans. This means they have 3 photoreceptors within the eye, and base their color combinations on those 3 colors. Humans base their color combinations on red, blue, and green, whilst bees base their colors on ultraviolet light, blue, and green. This is the reason why bees can't see the color red. They don't have the photoreceptor for it. They can, however, see reddish wavelengths, such as yellow and orange. They can also see blue-green, blue-violet, and so-called bees purple. Bees purple is a combination of yellow and ultraviolet light. That's why humans can't see it. Even though humans can see more colors in total, bees have a much broader range of color vision. Their ability to see ultraviolet light gives them an advantage when seeking out nectar. Many patterns on flowers are invisible to humans. These nectar bull's eyes, as they're sometimes called, are visible only to certain types of animals, such as bees, that have the ability to see ultraviolet light. This bee vision, if you wish to call it such, makes finding nectar much easier. In fact, some flowers, such as sunflowers, primroses, and pansies, have nectar trails that can only be seen in ultraviolet light. So in this sense, bees evolved ultraviolet vision because it aided them in survival and fitness. But humans and other primates would likely not have obtained any advantage from this ability, and therefore we never developed it. And yet, beyond light, there are things that would be incredibly beneficial to see that we co-evolved with but cannot see. I am, of course, speaking of microorganisms. The emergence of microorganisms predates the emergence of complex life by well over 2 billion years, and hominids by some 3.5 billion years, give or take. How many microorganisms can we see with the naked human eye? About 0. And yet, it would be incredibly useful to be able to see them because of the enormous impact they have on our environment and health. Both bacteria and viruses are invisible to the human eye and can only be viewed with the aid of microscopes. Bacteria are single-celled organisms that can largely live independently of other organisms, and their presence can lead to a host of diseases and health problems such as strep throat, tuberculosis, and cholera, amongst many others. Viruses, by way of contrast, are microorganisms that can replicate only inside the cells of host organisms, and their presence can lead to many negative health outcomes as well, such as influenza, measles, and our current global confidant, the pestilence. Although there are many differences between viruses and bacteria, the single most salient similarity between them is the fact that we cannot see them, nor could we at any point in time in the past. Despite a dim awareness that quarantines were a reasonably effective tool against the spread of disease as early as the 14th century, congruent with the emergence of the bubonic plague, and the word quarantine itself being derived from the Italian term 40 giorni, or period of 40 days, the amount of time that docking ships had to stay at port in Venice before venturing forth, a precautionary measure, the mechanics behind the spread of disease were not well understood until the mid-19th century. Indeed, it was not until the 1860s, when Louis Pasteur's germ theory of disease was proven and vindicated, that humans had any precise notion of the etiology of this type of illness. This is then further refined by one Robert Koch, who discovered that different types of microbes cause different types of diseases in 1876, and then further reified when the British nurse Florence Nightingale discovered that cleanliness and hygiene were essential to reducing the rates of infectious disease. Now, I want you to think about that for a while. For virtually the entire span that our species has been on planet Earth, no one had a single clue about the origin and spread of disease via microbes of any sort. It wasn't that they couldn't distinguish between viruses and bacteria. They weren't even aware of their existence, nor were they aware of the importance of bathing, cleanliness, and other countermeasures. What were they aware of? They were aware of the cave lion growling threateningly at them, or of the woolly mammoth poised to charge, and probably of any potential Godzilla to boot. They were aware of the clouds and rain. In brief, things they could see and feel. This is virtually the entire basis for the problem of the unseen, and goes well beyond microbial threats to some of the most complex problems of human psychology and behavior. As a species, we respond remarkably well to visible threats, such as those of rampaging Godzillas, the response being reinforced and supported by the obvious visibility of the problem. Likewise, a blizzard or thunderstorm would be felt, and obviously extant, as they would have a direct effect on the humans experiencing them. By way of comparison, we are much, much worse at anything that does not fall within that paradigm. And this is why, more so with the current pestilence or with the threat or damage done by a hurricane, you get so much more variety in interpretation, reaction, and suggestion of appropriate response. Few, if any, would deny the existence of a hurricane, but there are some people who do not believe in the existence of the microbial world because, unsurprisingly, they cannot see it. Although at times it is an odd coincidence that these self-same people believe in miscellaneous supernatural phenomena ranging from spirits to gods and all sorts of unseen things, with arguably less evidence, since such things cannot be seen even with a microscope. The considerable degree of variability in the response to the current global affair largely at the level of individual, with variations on the one hand that state that the current issue is harmless and nothing should have been changed from our normal routine, to extreme and some might argue hyperbolic caution to variance in between the two extremes demonstrates but one thing, that consensus when it comes to the problems of the unseen world, where we must rely in part on authority and cautious understanding of things we did not evolve to understand, or in some cases are not capable of understanding, puts us in a difficult position, as we have arguably come so far as a civilization to have largely conquered most visible, obvious threats, at least in the developed world. Generally speaking, in the developed world, most people are not starving. Generally speaking, most people have some form of shelter. Generally speaking, upon receiving an injury, most people can get some form of treatment, to speak nothing of the likelihood that you will get run down by a pack of hungry dire wolves and be their dinner. By and large, the primary challenges our ancestors faced have been largely, not entirely, overcome, which one might argue is a sign of just how adaptive we are and how far we've come as a species. And that is, in some sense, true. We have, as a species, come very far, but the newer challenges are those things that lie in the unseen world, the things we cannot perceive with our own senses, the many, many problems that emerge from complex systems. These are the principal problems we face, which is not to say that we could not be struck down by some of these older, more visible problems. We most certainly could be, but the greater challenges we face are not the ones that we have spent countless millennia attempting to overcome, but rather the ones that we have only recently become aware of. For example, it is extremely unlikely that anyone in the ancestral environment was obese. Yet in the modern environment is a very common phenomenon, which one could ostensibly argue is simply solved by putting down the fork and eating less, which, although technically true, does not examine the etiology of the problem, the endocrinological factors, the environmental factors, the psychological factors, etc. If it were truly as simple as putting down the fork, with nothing beyond that, obesity would be rather simple to solve, as would be any other addiction, such as opioid addiction, alcoholism, and everything under the sun. Yet each and every one of these challenges belies the complexity and invisibility involved that prevents ready-made solutions of the sort one might propose for addressing a problem related to lack of shelter or food. The bottom line is that we cannot see it in the simplest of grug terms. We are going to struggle to understand it, and often we either underestimate or alternatively overestimate the severity of a problem, all the while proposing workarounds that are at best piecemeal solutions that attempt to universalize solutions that cannot be, such as singular solutions to complex psychological problems that are highly individualistic in nature. This is an extension of the problem of self-extrapolation, where a problem can only be confronted and dealt with if a person has experienced it firsthand. And sometimes it goes like this. Person A had problem X, where X might be defined as an addiction, and solved it by applying solution Y. Person A then meets person B, who ostensibly also suffers from problem X, which prompts person A to suggest solution Y. Person B tries in earnest to implement solution Y, but with little to no success, whereupon both individuals become frustrated with each other and part ways. Now the problem with problem X, no pun intended, is that it's being treated as if there are only one solution applicable, based on an individual's experience. So whilst addictions will always have some overlap, the particularities of addiction may or may not, hence why addiction and most psychological problems are as invisible in their own right as bacteria and viruses. Neither did we evolve to understand things such as the problem of exponentiation, the most common means of explaining the problem. One we did not evolve to understand is sometimes called the lily pad in the pond problem. There's a pond of a certain size, and upon that pond floats a single lily pad. This particular species of lily pad reproduces once a day, so that on day 2 you get 2 lily pads. On day 3 you have 4, and so on. If it takes these lily pads 48 days to cover the pond completely, how long will it take for the pond to be covered halfway? And I will leave you to contemplate the answer. Needless to say, our ancestors never thought about such problems, though it sure would have been useful in understanding exponential growth and pandemics, something they experienced in abundance. The only way past the visible-only approach is to strenuously change our paradigm of thinking, something that we as a species simply did not evolve to do, something made manifest both in a reaction of common folk and in the reaction of the authorities themselves. No one really knows what is best to do, but a concession of ignorance is tantamount to a concession of failure, and therefore is always to be avoided in public discourse. Had politicians done nothing, and negative things had happened, they would have been held accountable for those things. Just as, even as I speak, they are being held accountable for the things they are doing right now. And in both cases, some non-trivial part of the population would say that they are making very serious mistakes in how they're going about this and treating this, or not treating it for that matter. All this is further complicated by the fact that it seems within but a few weeks, virtually every person has become either an epidemiologist or virologist with great understanding of the current affair, despite the extreme likelihood that we are laboring away with insufficient data to make any definitive claims one way or another. Add to this an increasingly justified distrust of authority, and you have the current crisis we now face. It all brings new meaning to the phrase, seeing is believing. And where belief, if we are honest with ourselves, evolved to be predicated on that principle, we are almost certain to be hounded by problems of this sort that will defy our evolved nature and understanding and eventually lead us down the path of extinction. Thank you very much for watching. As this channel operates solely off of the generosity and contributions of its subscribers, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Any and all support is more than appreciated. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.